Well, so if you go back to when the BRICS was created, this is like 20 plus years ago. It was first just BRIC and with a small
That was 2001,
S.
yeah.
And then it became BRICS with a big S when they admitted South Africa. I think the fact pattern in that organization is pretty poor. You know, when they first got organized, they tried to create a competitor to the IMF. I think it's called the IDB, the International Development Bank. That bank has not disbursed a single dollar in 23 years. They tried to create a joint program to lay undersea fiber amongst these countries, hasn't even started. So I think it's good that this organization is growing. I think the problem is that the actual amount of legislative coordination that these countries has been able to exhibit has been literally zero. And the problem now is that their regional rivalries are only growing. So China and India, which are the two anchor partners of BRICS, are literally in a land war. There's a border that they fight over with guns. You have a growing anti-Chinese resentment inside of both India and Brazil. Nick, you can just throw up this little chart. In India, they've blocked a lot of apps. They're about to block a bunch of imports. But India sees China as an existential threat. The Brazilian population, this is just a poll that The Economist put in. There's just a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment. So it's very hard to see folks that are such polar enemies actually working together, even if they're part of an organization. So I think that the odds of legislative coordination in the future are probably less than what they were even 10 years ago. So I expect even less, and it's hard to expect even less when nothing has been done. And then the second is I just look at the data, and if you look at SWIFT in July, the SWIFT volumes on US dollars was the largest ever. And so it's kind of one of these weird things where I think that it's good that organization exists. Don't get me wrong, because I do think that if they could, the other thing that I'll say about the BRICS, which is kind of odd, is that unlike the G7 and unlike NATO, where you have democratic ideals that underpin the organizational framework, here it doesn't, because you have China, Russia, Iran, which are total polar opposites to Brazil and India in terms of democratic governance. And I don't know enough about Ethiopia or Egypt to say anything. So if they're
challenged states at a minimum.
Well, no, I'm just saying they're not democratic. The way NATO and the G7 are all democratically elected countries.
It's a very good point. They don't share the same operating system. The authoritarians and democratic nations put together.
So then the last thing is, could you see a currency framework to compete against the US dollar? And I think the practical complexity is, if you take all of these other issues, land wars and import controls and growing Chinese resentment, and now try to boil that into an exchange rate mechanism where the renminbi and the rupee and the real can be interchangeable, I think it's very difficult to see, because if you look at the last time that happened, the franc, the lira, the pound, sterling, the Deutschmark, that was possible because all of those other factors were not on the table. They were not fighting with each other. There wasn't this anti-resentment in one country to another country. They roughly held the same democratic ideals. So I think my comment is, I think it's good that BRICS is growing. I think that if they can get some legislative or policy coordination wins, it'll be great. The track record is literally zero. And the setup doesn't, to me, mean much yet, but hopefully that something happens. Who knows?
Arguments about the pragmatism of non-dollar denominated trade and the progress that's been realized or can be projected to be realized from current policy can be debated. But what I think is most important is the signal that's being given, which is that there is a desire by a larger percentage of global GDP than is represented by the G7 to de-dollarize. And so while these intentions may be difficult to translate into policy in the near term, that signal says a lot about the influence and perhaps the policy of the US in addressing and dealing with a lot of these countries and global economic actors.
But I don't think they want to de-dollarize. That's not part of their
They want to increase trade as the stated mission, and they want to collaborate on trade. That is the stated mission.
Do you think the state admission is de-dollarization, or do you think the implicit outcome is de-dollarization?
No, the local currency support initiatives are implicit de-dollarization. I don't hear anyone saying we got to destroy the dollar, because they're all very important trade partners. Most of those countries are very important trade partners with the US and very dependent on trade with the US. It seems less that it's about, hey, we've got to hurt the US, and it's more about we have to be independent from the US. We have to be independent. Implicit in that is independent from the US. So, and I think that tone, that signal, says a lot about US economic policy and US foreign policy, that there's something off with the unipolarity, as Sachs has pointed out, that it's not de facto anymore, that there is intention here for there to be something different.
Yeah, that's very healthy. That's very, very healthy.
And I think that opens up avenues and paths that we're not thinking about today.
Yeah, I agree
that all of a sudden we'll wake up and we'll be like, whoops. And we need to be thoughtful about that.
I think that's the most powerful part of Sachs's commentary, is that it's a very firm establishment, even of the non-unipolarity of the world. But the thing that the BRICS have to do is, I would just encourage them, book a quick win. There has to be some policy coordination that they could do to prove that there's something there that's more than just a get-together once a year. And that's been missing for 22 years so far. And that would have a really important, I think, effect. Yeah, I agree with you, David. I think that's the litmus test. That hasn't happened yet.
Let me partially agree with that and then partially respond to what you were saying before, Chamath. So it's true that BRICS does not have an impressive record of accomplishment to date. That's simply true. However, recent events, I think, have provided the motivation for this group of countries to now try and get something done. In the past, it was just so phenomenally convenient to be based on the US dollar complex, because everything's priced in dollars, easy to transact in dollars. And when you run a trade surplus, the US has an open capital account and you can just park the money in US treasuries. So there was never a reason for any of these countries to want to leave the US dollar complex until more recently, when again, US foreign policy has militarized and weaponized the dollar and to try and make it a coercive instrument to get these countries to do what the US wants. And all those countries now are bristling at that, and they want to maintain their sovereignty. And so now they have tremendous motivation to get this done. Now, the thing they've already agreed to and done as part of BRICS is that when you join BRICS, you agree not to sanction any other member of BRICS. That is a meaningful commitment. And obviously, it has a lot to do with this Ukraine war and the fact the U.S. has been demanding that the whole world sanction Russia. And most of the world has not been sanctioning Russia. And that's why the sanctions have not been effective, is the U.S. has not been able to get that done. The U.S. will not be able to get it done in the future with respect to at least the countries who are members of BRICS with regard to their trade with each other. And as we saw in the percentage of world GDP, BRICS very rapidly, once they add a few more members, are going to be at about 50% of world GDP. So the U.S. is only going to be able to influence, call it roughly that half, a global GDP, where the U.S. or the G7 is a major trading partner. Now, what BRICS will be lacking is the way on a technical level to bring about the sovereignty they want. So they need to have a way to settle and clear transactions, and they need to have a place to park the surplus that's created for net exporters. And they haven't quite figured that out yet. So, for example, there's a recent news item where Russia, which is selling a huge amount of oil to India right now, it was saying that they don't want to accumulate more rupees. So they've got to figure out, well, what do we do with all these extra rupees? So there's a lot of pieces to figure out here. And that is why they're saying this is a goal they have over the next 5 to 10 years. It's not 1 to 2 year time frame, it's 5 to 10 years. But
yeah, let them they should make their own euro. If they feel so strongly that they're a great voting bloc, make a euro. And then they could all put into it. And you can see what happens when a bunch of dictators and a long tail of failed states now share a common currency. It's not going to work. These countries are all at each other.
Yeah, failed states who share
Egypt,
GDP
Ethiopia,
has been
these
going
ones
up like
are
a
all
rocket.
very troubled states, by the way. Yeah, I mean,
Their share
how?
of GDP has been going up like a rocket, Jake. That's the whole point.